Last time we left off, we were talking about the institution of ghettos and the treatment of Jews in Poland. So now I thought we would talk a little bit about the Jews in Western Europe. So let's talk about France first of all. So soon after the armistice, the French actually introduced their first anti-Jewish law by themselves. So German Jewish refugees who didn't have German citizenship, because if you remember the Germans took it away from them, they had to report to internment camps. So they made all foreigners report to internment camps. There were 47,000 that had to be in these camps, and over 40,000 of them were actually Jewish. So they had to report before the Germans invaded, because they had run away from the Nazis, but they put them in internment camps to make sure that they weren't Nazis. But then, right after they were freed, Germany invaded France, and therefore they had to be returned to camps by this French law. And actually many would die in these camps because they would never be released. And they weren't given proper housing and proper food, so they eventually died. Now, in France, anti-Semitism was quite high. On the eve of the war, there were 47 different anti-Semitic periodicals, journals, and magazines. Just to give you one example, someone named Lucien Rabaté. The Jews are bugs and rats, but much more harmful. However, as they are human bipeds, we do not demand their extermination. They should only be driven out of Europe and punished. So, as you can see, that's more the extreme right of these French anti-Semitic periodicals, but obviously there was a fair bit of anti-Semitism in France, and it would actually find expression in a political party. There were 3 collaborationist parties, but one in particular, which is known as Action. It's French Action. I can't say it in French. I'm not even going to bother because I'm going to butcher it. Anyway, this party was a Catholic party that had been excommunicated for its anti-Semitism by Pius XI. French Action. I can spell it. It's a French name. Do you really care? Anyway, Pius XII actually reinstituted this party, so he lifted the excommunication on this party. Despite being renowned for its rabid anti-Semitism, he lifted the excommunication right before the war. And this party would play a very critical role in trying to further the anti-Semitic agenda of the Vichy government. So Vichy quickly introduced several anti-Semitic laws. One of the first things they did was repeal the Marchandeau law. Oh, I messed that up too. Of April 20, it had just been passed April 21st, 1939, and that law was to prohibit incitement on racial grounds or religious grounds. So the French had actually instituted a law the year before not to incite on racial not to incite against particular races, and of course Vichy repealed this right away. What was your question? Oh, okay. Vichy? Okay, so the northern half of France was administered by the Germans. Okay, but at the start of the war, until 1943, they allowed the southern half to be administered by the French. And that was called the Vichy government because the capital of that semi-country was in a town called Vichy, which is a spa town, actually. But these laws culminated on October 3rd with the introduction of the Jewish statute, which mirrored the Nuremberg laws. You guys stop that. The Nuremberg laws, the Jewish statute defined a Jew racially. Okay, actually it's interesting because the Nuremberg laws did it to Jews religiously, but these laws defined Jews racially, that they had to have Jewish grandparents just as long as they were of the Jewish race. If you recall, the Nuremberg laws actually, or it was more even, if you had religious grandparents. So it's slightly different than the German Nuremberg laws. But they did these laws did the typical things like prohibiting Jews from serving public office, began to repeal ownership on certain things, etc. So, do you think that this was supported by the French population at large?
Probably.
So yes it was. And was there any protests from the Catholic Church? No, there was not. The leadership of the French Catholic Church met on April 31st, 1940 and issued this proclamation. In political terms, the problem is caused by a community that has resisted all assimilation, dispersion, and national integration. The state has the right and duty to make sure that the persistence of this unity does not cause any harm to the common good of the nation. Okay, so the Catholic Church basically said they're not going to protest any of these laws. And this is really how it would go really in all countries. As we're going to see a little later, the Catholic Church mainly focused, even at times didn't even do such a good job, but their basic focus was to save converts to the religion, and not people that were still Jewish, per se. Now, again, so we talked about the northern part of France, the German army administered these laws, the Nuremberg laws, registration of Jewish businesses. But again, as we talked about before, the most ominous was the census of all the Jews, which was actually done on Rosh Hashanah of 1940. So that's when it started. Okay? So, that is it for France for now. Let's talk about Holland. So, what have you guys heard on how Holland dealt with the Jews?
They're alright.
They didn't do anything?
They were sweet.
Well, what have you heard? What do you think?
They were sweet. No, they were mean.
So, at the beginning, they actually were supportive of Jews. Okay, the Germans clamped down on them, and then after a certain time, they were obedient. But at the beginning, this was not that way.
They realized their potential.
What?
We had potential.
I'm not quite sure that's what it was, but the German administrators in Amsterdam approached the Dutch members of the Amsterdam government and asked them if they would establish a ghetto, and they said no. Okay? So what the Germans did instead was they tried to get, there were Dutch Nazis, so they tried to get them to go around and start fights with Jews. And what happened was on February 19th, 1941, a Jewish owner of an ice cream parlor thought that German police were actually Dutch Nazis, and he sprayed them with ammonium gas. And
They had ammonium gas just sitting in their pockets like,
I think it's part of what
I think it was actually in pepper spray?
NH4 is ammonium, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it must have something to do with keeping it cold, or.
Does that kill them?
I think it burned them severely, but.
Well, why were they supportive of Jews in the first place?
What?
Why are they supportive of Jews in the first place?
What? No.
Because they were human beings. I didn't bring. You want me to bring the quote next week for what? Okay, we'll get there in a second. Hold on, we'll get there in a second. Okay. Excuse me? No. And yeah, Tarantino movies aren't history movies. So, in response to this, the Germans sealed the Jewish quarter in Amsterdam, and they arrested 389 young Jewish men and deported them to Buchenwald and Mauthausen. And only one of them would survive the war. Okay? So, and this is just at the beginning, right? They just died because they weren't able to survive the war. They didn't. I don't think they shot or killed these ones. They did that when they captured other ones. I believe they killed some of them by making them run naked into electrical fences. They also We talked about with Mauthausen, if you recall, remember the quarry? We talked about the quarry? Well, no. Remember we talked about the quarry with the steps, and they had to run up with 100-pound rocks on their back, and if they dropped them, they'd crush the guy behind them? Right? And how they would commit suicide. So that's how they did it. And the other ones that were left, they would make them run what was called the gauntlet. Basically, they beat them and whipped them, and if they made it through there, they would be shot. They wouldn't be machine gunned from the guard towers. Okay, so that's how they killed. When they arrested some Dutch Jews at the beginning, that's what they did to them in Buchenwald and Mauthausen. Now, again, so we were talking about why they would do it. So I don't have the actual quote of the dean, but the dismissal of Jewish professors in Holland actually caused the students and the faculty to go on strike in the two universities of Leiden and Delft. Okay, and the dean made a compelling speech, which I didn't quote, but basically the quote is that these are human beings and they're members of our faculty, they're illustrious members of our faculty. Why should we get rid of them? Why should we treat them badly? What? Well, so the Germans, right, part of the Nuremberg laws, they wouldn't be able to hold public office and things of that nature, so they would get rid of Jewish faculty members also. That happened in Holland. In France, actually, the French universities got rid of them before the Germans told them to. So that was why? They didn't like Jews. I'd say that would have to be more native anti-Semitism than anything else, because what?
Like French people.
That's all. You're off to the side. Nobody can see your face. Okay, so they, in response to the strike in the university, they arrested the dean and some of the students. Protestant churches also protested the German administrators, and in February 1941, workers in Amsterdam and in other cities staged strikes to protest anti-Jewish brutality. So, at the beginning, the Dutch really tried to show their solidarity, and the Germans clamped down on it. The Germans, they shot at protesters, they arrested protesters, they beat protesters. So eventually, after a time, these type of public protests stopped. But I think definitely you have to give credit, because there weren't too many other places where these kind of public displays happened in any kind of numbers at all. So I would definitely have to say that about the Dutch. So now we're into 1940, late 1940. In December 1940, Hitler made a decision to invade Russia, and the invasion of Russia was to commence on May 15th. Anybody know what the code name for the invasion of Russia was?
Barbarossa?
Yes.
What?
What does that mean? Barbarossa. Yes. Who was Redbeard?
Pirate?
No. He wasn't a pirate. No. He was Frederick III, I believe, who was a Prussian king. And he was a famous Prussian king. The interesting thing actually is that he drowned in a river. So it is actually interesting why Hitler tried to evoke that. But anyway, that's what he changed it to. And Hitler did this because he believed that the U.S. would continue. All right, did we talk about Lend-Lease? Any of you know what Lend-Lease is? What? Who lent? Yes. The Americans is essentially a plan to give people fighting the Germans equipment. So Hitler believed that the U.S. would continue to give equipment to the point where anybody fighting the Germans would have an inexhaustible supply. And he also thought that the U.S. would intervene in the continent in 1942, primarily because he thought that the Jews had Roosevelt's ear and that they would force him to do it, which, as we've seen, was not really the case at all. But that was his decision. And These plans would be altered because on March 27th, 1941, there was a coup in Yugoslavia to overthrow the pro-German government there, and Hitler retaliated, and he sent the army into Yugoslavia. Also, at the same time, if you recall, last class we mentioned about Mussolini invading Greece and it not going very well. He also sent troops to Greece and eventually to Crete. What this did was it set back the German invasion of Russia by a month. And many historians contend that that month was critical for the lack of success of the German invasion. Exactly, because of the winter. And that if they would have had one more month, they would have succeeded in taking Moscow, and that really would have been, that would have made a real difference. Obviously, it's hard to think about. Yes, it was huge, but really Moscow was the nerve center where they controlled everything from. And it would have, and we haven't really talked about it, we're probably not going to, but Stalin, it seems that Stalin suffered what could be called, a nervous breakdown. He really didn't respond very well to the invasion, and there is a definite school of thought that believes that he never really would have recovered. Had they lost Moscow, he would have really lost control. So definitely the fact that the winter came and the Germans were really completely unprepared. They didn't have winter clothing, right? They didn't have winter clothing. They didn't know how to deal with the tanks in the snow. So I don't even have numbers. I know they lost a lot of people to frostbite and cold-related injuries.
How did they not plan that? Like, they knew Russia.
They thought that they would have won by then. They thought they would have won by then. They actually, if you think about it, they continued to think that even when they had invaded Russia, because they were going so far so fast, right? It seems really hard to believe that they could have thought that, obviously, because Russia is huge. But it's what? Yeah, but they figured that. I think they figured that if they could get to the big, if they could get into Leningrad, if they could get into Moscow, that they would find stuff. Maybe. I don't know. They didn't prepare for it well. They were a little too arrogant. But that really, I think, is it. Those 4 weeks, and I've seen other people say that as well, those 4 weeks really made a tremendous deal. Okay? So now they're going to invade Russia. In sync with this, the anti-Jewish steps were planned in Russia. On January 30th, 1941, Hitler repeated his prophecy of January 30th, 1939. But instead of mentioning that war would end in the extermination of the Jews, he only said, put an end to Jewry's role in Europe. So, some historians contend that this might not necessarily have meant extermination right away. It could just have meant deportation. So at this point, again, there is no real conclusive evidence that the final solution, as it came to be called, was decided on at this point. We'll see why that is in just a second. On March 26th, the SS was given full autonomy for maintaining security behind the front. So after the army went by, every rear area would be controlled by the SS. And on May 19th, the chief of the army ordered soldiers to take, quote-unquote, ruthless action against the carriers of the Jewish Bolshevik ideology. Okay, so what does this mean? It means this order was really to shoot Soviet commissars. Anybody know what a commissar is?
Sergeant?
Those are the people who are in charge of they choose who rules in Russia.
So you're close. So basically, every Russian army unit would have officers, but they also would have a commissar, who is in charge of the political well-being of the unit. Actually, Nikita Khrushchev was a commissar in Stalingrad. You know who Nikita Khrushchev is? Anybody?
After Stalin.
What?
Wasn't he after
He's the
Stalin?
future,
I think yes.
like, leader of Russia.
Yeah. I think there was somebody in between though. I don't know why. Was there?
There was
I think
three
he was with
people
two
that
other
rolled
people.
together, and then
Was Barry?
People took after Stalin, and I think he
there was a
on
group
top.
of three.
Was
that
Beria in
went
between?
together
Beria was in between.
after Stalin, and then Stalin really pushed it. Not Stalin.
Well, Stalin died in 1953.
Right.
Well, people think they were poisoned. Well, some people say it was poisoned. Anyway, yeah, he was the head of Russia during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
He took over in 1955.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because in 1956 is when he gave this famous speech where he went again after Stalin. It's actually interesting. Stalin has been rehabilitated in Russia now, and he's looked upon as a hero, despite the fact that he's credited with killing over 50 million people. Just interesting to think about as Russia perhaps moves back towards that kind of autocratic government. If you're interested in current politics. Anyway, so the June 1941 issue of the Information to the Troops, so this was a political document assigned to all German troops. This is about commissars. To call beastly the traits of these people, a large percentage of whom are Jews, would be an insult to animals. In these commissars we see the uprising of subhumans against normal blood. So you see, even at the same time that they're mentioning Bolshevism, it's really linked inextricably with Judaism as well.
Why?
What?
Why? Because Jew invented it?
No, well, not really. Well, again, at the beginning of the Russian Revolution, there were Jews, right? Trotsky is Jewish. His last name is really Bernstein. Kamenev was Jewish. I think Zinoviev was Jewish. There were a lot of Jews.
Jewish?
What?
The head of the secret police was Jewish.
Yeah.
Dzerzhinsky was Jewish? I'm not sure he was Jewish. I'm not sure about that. What? Marx is Jewish. Engels wasn't, though. Stalin was not. He's Georgian. Who else? Yeah, so there was that. In Hungary, there was a short communist revolution, and the leader was Bela Kun, who was Jewish, and there were a lot of Jews there. But it was also, you're right, everything. What we talked about before is that Marx and everything was blamed on the Jews. Jews as financiers. Right? Marx said that the Jews were the capitalists, right? So, right, from all sides, Jews were blamed. So, actual orders on killing Jews were given by Heydrich, if you remember, Reinhard Heydrich, on two different occasions. One in Berlin on June 17th, and that was to unit commanders. And then, 1 or 2 days later, in a Polish town which was really a staging area for the Einsatzgruppe. So the truth is that nobody actually knows what the exact orders were. There's a bit of argument about that. Friedlander believes that the order was given only to kill Jewish men. However, that the orders were ambiguous enough that when they decided to expand their campaign, it could easily be based on the orders given here. Goldhagen believes that at this moment, before they invaded, the order to kill all Jewish people was given. Okay? So there is some degree of argument. So at this time, all that is in agreement is that there was definitely orders to kill Jewish men. And Friedlander says you can still link this to the Germans believed that they were the carriers of Bolshevik ideology. So that's one of the continuous things we're going to talk about. Actually, in a couple of seconds, I just wanted to go through, we talked about the ghetto last week pretty quickly, but I wanted to go through a couple more personal things about that. But it does seem odd that they got rid of a lot of their productivity, and they got rid of a lot of productive workers, which is the reason why, one of the reasons why Goldhagen says, that it was eliminationist anti-Semitism, they were driven to kill them. they decided to kill them, not that it was against their will, but the thing was is that it wasn't logical at all because they needed them. And even when they needed them more as time went on, they started killing them more. So again, so you have that definite paradox. So, okay, so that's the order to do that. There was also plans to induce starvation in large segments of the population, obviously starting first with the Jews. This is from testimony of an SS general that said that Himmler, on the night of June 12th, said that the Russian campaign would determine Germany's fate as a great power for all time, or result in their complete, or our complete, annihilation. And that the starvation would kill 20 to 30 million of the Slavic population and result in the removal of the Jewish people from Europe. So again, at this time, there were still plans. There were even plans to move the Jews to Siberia if the Germans won. So again, Friedlander says you cannot conclusively say that the decision here was made to kill all the Jews, rather to kill the men and to try and move the rest of them where they could be controlled. Obviously, they would eventually die out, but they wouldn't be killed out. So now let's talk a bit about the ghetto. I know we talked about it last week, a lot of figures. So now I have more quotes from people that were there. So first, in the ghettos, the administrators of the ghettos acted differently in different places. In Lodz, the commander wanted to allow a level of economic activity that would provide for a minimum subsistence, so people could work and make money to have food, and they would survive. The commander in Warsaw didn't care whether the Jews starved to death or not. So in Warsaw, they didn't really, at the beginning, they didn't try and utilize them for work. Even when they did utilize them for work, they took most of their money. So right off the top, the German administrators imposed a 65% tax on Jewish wages. Okay, so Jews they weren't getting that much money in the first place. They were getting even less right off the bat. Also, German companies who were responsible for their Jewish workers didn't even give them raw material or food sometimes, and they actually just kept the difference. I assume that they were getting contracts from the German government, is what that is talking about. So even when the German commanders wanted them to get food, they still weren't getting enough food really to subsist much above chronic starvation. So chronic starvation was really the state of affairs in most of these ghettos. These are the kind of things that may arise in this sort of situation. Just wanted to present a couple of these things to you, that some of the leaders of the council in Lodz, they wrote down things that happened. So on January 12th, 1941, okay, this is what they write. So appearing at one of the precincts, an 8-year-old boy filed a report against his own parents, whom he charged with not giving him the bread ration due to him. The boy demanded that an investigation be conducted and that the guilty parties be punished.
A Jewish boy?
Yeah, this is in the ghetto. Okay?
What happened?
What happened? I don't know what happened. The point is, several things could have happened, all of which are extremely hard to take. One, his parents didn't give him the food, right? Two, his parents gave him the food, but he's so angry at them that he wants them to get punished because they don't have enough food to give him. You know? I mean, either of those things are just extremely hard to take, right? And what are the people listening to it supposed to do? Right? They can't give them any more food, really. So, so that's extremely hard to understand. And this is at the same time that more people were being put to work. In Warsaw, the number of Jews that were productively employed went from 35,000 to 95,000 from September 1941 to July 1942. But the situation didn't get any better. For example, I'm about to read something this is from the Polish Underground, so this isn't written by a Jew. It says that further crowding in the ghetto has resulted in conditions of ill health, hunger, and poverty that defy all description. Beggars sit and lie along the walls, and the sight of people collapsing from starvation in the street is common. The refuge for abandoned children takes in 12 infants a day. Every day more people die on the street. Contagious diseases are spreading, especially tuberculosis. The German treatment of the Jews is always exceptionally inhuman. Okay, so even outsiders recognize how terrible it was. Right? Okay. So we talked about last week what things they weren't allowed to eat, and I think one of you guys asked me what they did eat. So what they did eat was potatoes, right? Actually, they ate latkes. So a man named Hirsch Wasser, so this is in Lodz in 1941. What he said was, there's a sound economic basis for the plethora of latke shops. The public eats 1 or 2 latkes instead of breakfast, lunch, or supper. Bread is becoming a dream, and a hot lunch belongs to the world of fantasy. Things are certainly grave if latkes are becoming a national dish.
Is this in the ghetto?
Yeah, this is in Lodz, the Lodz ghetto. So it's the second largest ghetto in Poland. This is in 1941. Okay, so the extremely difficult conditions for the Jews living in these ghettos. And so the tendency was for people to try and stick with their group. Okay, so people, Orthodox people stuck with Orthodox people, Zionists, Bundists they're more right-wing. Politically, they were with themselves. So again, people start to separate into their small, I guess the smallest, like it's the lowest common denomination. But some of the stuff that I actually think is amazing, they started, there were some Jewish welfare services that started. For example, an organization called Jewish Social Self-Help was able to aid over 160,000 people in the Warsaw Ghetto in its first year. Okay, so even in spite of all the difficulties, there were still people trying to deal with welfare on a massive level. And obviously, it didn't work as well as they wanted it to, but I mean, just the ability to, with all those restrictions, to be able to help that many people, I think is pretty unbelievable. And also something that you don't really think about when you think of the ghetto. Do you think people went to school? As though you guys are in school. Yeah, do you think they had schools in the ghetto?
Yeah, they had theaters in the ghetto.
Yeah, so you're partly right when you said no. They were forbidden to have schools until late 1941. But then they were allowed to open schools, and they had grade schools. They also had high schools. Interestingly enough, the Warsaw Ghetto opened a library that had books in 3 languages. Yeah.
Why would they need education, for example? Why would the Germans allow to have it if there's no need for...
Create a false sense of hope and whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that's a large part of it. For example, the Germans let Jewish political activity continue really unabated. They didn't do anything against the Zionists or people of that nature. I think because it might not necessarily at this point have been to lull them to sleep so that they could kill them. It might just have been they figured, what harm could they do? They're not going to rebel, really.
Keep them busy pretty much?
What? Keep them busy. Yeah, keep them busy.
Why would you not rebel? I understand the beginning why they didn't rebel. In 1941, why were they not rebelling by then?
Well, we've talked about it. You needed help from the outside. They got none.
Like, understandably so, right? So let's say like there's like 100 Germans guarding the ghetto.
But there were more.
I'd say there was 3,000.
And when you get out to
You have to remember. Okay, so the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, when they finally did it, right? What happened?
They all died.
Shot.
No, but okay. So the response was to bring in tanks and flamethrowers and just burn the whole place down. So I think while there still was some semblance of hope, I think also because in Poland especially, well, first of all, I think in the Western countries, they never believed anything bad would happen to them.
Yeah.
They believed that civilized Western society would always protect them, and that they would lose their rights for a while, but it would get better. So I think that's what the case was in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, I think they were used to anti-Semitism, and they figured it's bad, but, you know, we're alive and we've been here before.
They needed them for work also.
They kept thinking that they would be able to do that. But they did other things. They would bribe them. They tried to come up with ways to... A rebellion's irreversible, you know? There's no going back. So I think people were hesitant, while there still was some degree of hope to not have to go that route. People delayed. Also, what I just mentioned, people weren't united. So there was no Jewish underground that was 200,000 people strong and they all had guns, you know what I mean? Even the people that did want to rebel, at their most, they might have been groups of 100, I don't even know if they were bigger than that. I mean, you know, the Partisans in Defiance, that's probably the biggest Jewish partisan group. That was what, 1,000, 1,500? I mean, you need a lot of people, right? When they did rebel in the Warsaw Ghetto, they knew they were going to die. Mordechai Aplowitz, I think that's his name. One of the leaders said that essentially what he said was, the way we're going to die is we're going to be shot down in the street like stray dogs. So they waited until there was no hope, really. And still in 1941, they didn't contemplate, I don't think they contemplated that. I mean, now I think you have to remember, it's easier to contemplate that sort of thing because you've seen it before, right? On that sort of level, like once the Holocaust happens, right, and then you have things like Rwanda, you have things like Darfur. You're not surprised when one people tries to kill another people. It's not necessarily surprising. But I think in Europe back then, people thought, you know, we've come out of that. The Enlightenment has happened, and now we're different. You know, and I think it took the Holocaust for people to stop believing in humanity, I guess. That would be the long answer. The short question. But, so again, I thought establishing the library was very interesting.
Oh yeah, what were the three languages?
I assume it would be Polish, Hebrew, Yiddish, and Hebrew. Actually.
It's not that hard to teach Yiddish and Hebrew as they grow up. Yiddish, obviously.
Yeah, I know, but still, think about it. I'm not saying that they learned new languages in the library. I'm just saying it's very interesting that they were able to keep.
Wait, Lashon HaKodesh or Hebrew?
I don't even know. I don't know. I don't think these libraries are Sfarim.
Right.
I think that.
And Lucy Davidovitz, in the War Against the Jews, she mentions that a lot of the books in the libraries were like escapist literature, like westerns and this and thing. And people were distracted from their misery because they had no entertaining books to read.
And that's what people say about the orchestras also. They had multiple orchestras in the ghettos, and that's what people said. I didn't bring that here, but one of the quotes was basically along the lines of that people were going purely as an escape, and that it was something, you know, they were cold, they were hungry, but, you know, for that hour, for that 2 hours, they could hear music. You know, it could take them away from it all, really. But I just thought it was interesting that one of the people said that children confined to the ghetto didn't even know about plants or animals, that they didn't even know what a cow looked like, which I thought was interesting. I assume it means really young kids, like 5-year-olds or 6-year-olds. I hadn't left the ghetto in a couple of years. But what I also thought was very interesting was that the favorite adult book was something called The 40 Days of Musa Dagh, which actually is a novel set in the in 1915 during the Turkish genocide against the Armenians. I thought was pretty interesting. That I don't know if that's some sort of that they thought it was going to happen, or they just were trying to understand, but I don't know. That's what it is. So we talked about starvation, so this led to a lot of death, obviously. So deaths per month leveled off in 1941 at 6,000 a month. And this would be pretty well constant from starvation and illnesses before deportation started.
People who weren't starving, how were they not starving? Like, why did some people get more food than others?
Okay, so here it is. So there was anger against the Judenrat, right, for extensive corruption. One of the diarists said, "A contemporary Jewish prayer is now, 'O Lord, help me become a chairman so that I can allocate funds to myself.'" So people were on the Judenrat, or they knew people on the Judenrat. Also, people who were rich bribed themselves, were able to bribe their way out of it. Also, the taxation that the Judenrat did was indirect taxation. So it was taxation on basic commodities and services. So if you used things, you were taxed, right? It's like PSD or GST, right? It's like consumption taxes, right? But the people that needed to buy the most stuff were poor. So they just increased the tax burden on the poor. And the people that were rich stayed rich, right? And smuggling was huge. Smuggling was enormous. One guy mentioned that his name was Ringo Bloom. He wrote in his diary that he heard that in the cemetery they smuggled in 26 cows in a night. I have no idea how that's true, but it just seems extremely difficult to do that. But right, so that's just one example, maybe hypocritical, but there was an immense amount of smuggling. So that's how. What?
How were they leaving?
What do you mean? How were they leaving to get out to smuggle things in?
Yeah.
It could have been that Aryan guys would meet them. He wrote something about how conductors on Aryan trolleys would have some way to transfer to people on Jewish trolleys. You could have guys throwing things over fences.
You can't throw a cow over.
I know. So that's what I'm saying. I don't know how that. Okay, so during how they would escape through sewers, right? After the war, so I gave up, or they hide in sewers. I think they also used that to smuggle also, because there were ways out of the ghetto from the cemetery. You could use the sewer system. Things of that nature. I don't know how you get a cow in. That's why I said I don't know if it's actually a true story, but it was just. Excuse me?
Why do you keep a cow?
Killed it.
Yeah.
You killed 25 cows.
They were eating horses. Actually, they mentioned that they were using pig lard, and that the Rabbanim had allowed it. Make specific mention to that they were using pig lard, and that they had gotten special dispensation to do it. So I don't know exactly. I mean, there were obviously pretty ingenious ways of smuggling. Obviously, people got caught, but if you could pay people off, you could last. What? So, I mean, those are the kind of things that would happen. But I think two especially harsh stories that I just wanted to leave you with, because I don't know how much more we're going to talk about what's going on in the ghettos quite so much. So again, this I think his name was Mordechai Ringelblum also. Anyway, he was a leader of the uprising. He recounted a story. He said a special class of beggar consists of those who beg after 9 p.m. They walk out into the street not caring about curfew. Most of them are children. In the surrounding silence of night, the cries of hungry beggar children are terribly insistent. And however hard your heart, you throw down a piece of bread, or else leave the house. It is common for these beggar children to die on the sidewalk at night. I was told of a horrible scene where a 6-year-old beggar boy lay gasping all night, too weak to roll over to the piece of bread thrown down to him over the balcony. So, I mean, I don't think you really have to add anything to that. But obviously, incredibly difficult situations where kids. I mean, are their parents alive? Are their parents dead? Are they doing it for their families? You know, people much younger than us having to do that. Also, here's the last thing, just in terms of violence against the Jews. Hitler had been exhorting other nations to follow Germany's example, and on January 21st, 1941, the Romanian Iron Guard, they were backed by the SS, they tried to overthrow the government. But what they first decided to do was move against the Jews. So, again, here's another chronicler. He said, the stunning thing, so they killed a lot of them. The official sources said they only killed 93 people. He was Jewish, but he believes that there were a lot more. He said, the stunning thing about the Bucharest bloodbath is the quite bestial ferocity of it. Jews butchered in Streletsky were hanged by the neck on hooks normally used for beef carcasses. A sheet of paper was stuck to each corpse, kosher meat. Those killed in the forest were first undressed, because it would be a pity for their clothes to remain there, then shot and thrown on top of one another. Okay, and this is the type of violence that was an outcome of anti-Semitism, and that's really what we're going to see next week. We're going to talk about Russia and the start of the Einsatzgruppen and similar things, similar horrific things. We're moving into that period where the German drive to kill Jews really kicks into high gear. So that's it for today.